November 1943. A lone American fighter tears through the frozen sky above Nazi-occupied France, its engine roaring like thunder itself. Moments later, its fuel gauge hits empty. The pilot, Second Lieutenant William E. Roach, faces an impossible choice: ditch in the English Channel and die, or risk landing in enemy territory. He chooses the unthinkable. As his wheels kiss the grass of what looks like a friendly airfield, he realizes his mistake too late. The airfield is German. Within seconds, rifles surround his cockpit. His war is over. But for the Germans, something far greater has just begun. When the Luftwaffe engineers rolled his captured P-47 Thunderbolt into their hangars, they expected another crude American machine, big, loud, and simple. But as they opened its cowling and looked inside, they froze. What they found inside that plane, the technology, the materials, the sheer power, shook them to their core. It wasn't just an airplane. It was a message, a flying demonstration of what American industry could achieve while Germany was fighting for survival. And as they tested, measured, and flew it, one by one, the Luftwaffe's top engineers reached the same chilling realization. They had never seen power like it. Gear stay till the end of this video, because what you're about to hear is not just about a plane. It's about how a single machine shattered the confidence of Hitler's Air Force forever. November 7th, 1943. The war in Europe had reached a fever pitch. The skies above France and Germany burned daily with contrails, tracer fire, and the smoke of falling aircraft. Allied bombers now struck deeper into German territory, escorted by a new kind of fighter, a machine so large, so powerful, and so heavily armed that German pilots mockingly called it the milk jug. That fighter was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. On that freezing November morning, Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, took off from an airfield in southern England. His mission was routine: ferry his P-47D across the Channel to a forward base in France. But over the North Sea, a sudden navigation error turned routine into disaster. Thick fog rolled in. His compass malfunctioned, and within an hour, Roach had no visual bearings, no fuel, and no idea that he was flying east straight toward Germany. At around 11:20 a.m., his engine coughed, the massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp sputtering on its last drops of fuel. Below him, Roach saw what looked like a friendly airfield. He dropped his landing gear, circled once, and came in for a gentle landing. The wheels touched the ground perfectly until he noticed something wrong. The men on the runway weren't wearing khaki. They were wearing field gray uniforms, with black boots and swastika armbands. Before Roach could throttle back up, rifles surrounded his plane. He was captured instantly, the first fully intact P-47 Thunderbolt to fall into German hands. The Luftwaffe couldn't believe their luck. For months, their pilots had been reporting a new American fighter that could dive faster than anything in the sky, shrug off cannon shells, and climb even after taking massive damage. Many in the German high command dismissed these claims as exaggeration, until now. The captured aircraft was immediately taken to Rechlin Luftwaffe Test Center, Germany's most secretive aviation research base, located north of Berlin. Their engineers and test pilots examined every foreign plane they could get: Spitfires, Mustangs, even Soviet Yaks. But when the Thunderbolt arrived under guard, they realized they were dealing with something entirely different. The aircraft was assigned the code T9 plus FK, its American markings hastily painted over with black crosses. Over the next weeks, teams from Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Junkers gathered in Hangar No. 7 to witness what one German engineer would later describe as a miracle of brute engineering. When they opened the cowling and saw the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, they were stunned. It wasn't just powerful, it was impossibly advanced. 2 rows of 14 cylinders, turbo-supercharged, cooled and baffled with a precision that seemed alien to German design. Von Luftwaffe-Mechanik reportedly muttert: "Das ist keine Maschine. Das ist eine Fabrik." This isn't a machine. It's a factory. Everywhere they looked, they found something remarkable. Massive control surfaces powered by advanced hydraulic boosters. Electrical systems neatly color-coded and labeled, unheard of in German aircraft. Fuel lines reinforced and insulated against icing. And behind the cockpit, something that drew the most attention, a General Electric turbo-supercharger, mounted in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by a long exhaust duct. To German engineers, it looked almost absurd, but when they ran it, the results were staggering. The Thunderbolt's engine maintained full power at altitudes where German aircraft gasped for air. For the first time, the Luftwaffe understood why their Bf-109s and Fw-190s were being outclimbed and out of at 30,000 feet. Hans-Werner Lurk, one of Germany's top test pilots, recorded his impressions after his first flight in the captured P-47. It climbs like a mountain elevator and dives like a stone from the hand of God. We have nothing like it. The engineers documented everything: weight, thrust, climb rate, cooling efficiency, and ammunition layout. The Thunderbolt carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each with over 425 rounds, giving it more firepower than most German bombers. Its armor was so thick that even a direct hit from a 20mm cannon could fail to penetrate the cockpit plate. By the end of 1943, the P-47 was no longer just an airplane to the Germans. It was a revelation, a demonstration of what happened when a nation's industry, resources, and engineering discipline all worked together without constraint. At Rechlin, a quiet panic began to spread through the Luftwaffe's engineering circles. They could measure it, they could test it, but they knew they could never build it. November 18, 1943. At the Airpro Bungstelle Rechlin, Germany's top-secret Luftwaffe testing facility, the hangar doors slid open with a mechanical groan. Inside, surrounded by the frost of the German winter, stood a captured Titan. The Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, serial number 42 to 22,490, its olive drab paint now streaked with frost and dust. On its fuselage, American stars have been hastily covered with black crosses. A sign outside the hangar read, Geheime Kommandosache nur für Offiziere. Inside, the best engineers from Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and BMW Flugmotoren were gathered around the massive aircraft. Each man carried a clipboard, a pencil, and one shared question: how did the Americans build this? The chief of the investigation, Dr. I.N.G. Hans Mertens, had spent years perfecting German radial engines. Yet when he saw the Thunderbolt's Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, he could only stare in disbelief. He muttered, "They build engines the way we build factories." Every bolt, every weld, every cable was overbuilt but perfectly balanced. Unlike German designs, which prized minimalism and efficiency, the Thunderbolt was unapologetically massive. Its engine alone weighed more than an entire Bf-109 fuselage, yet ran smoother than any Daimler-Benz inline power plant the Germans had ever tested. Technicians began by removing the cowling. The metal came off easily, held by quick-release fasteners, something rare in German designs. Beneath, they found a network of meticulously routed cables and hoses. Every part was labeled in English, numbered for maintenance, and built for quick access. One mechanic noted in his logbook, "It is as if the machine was built not for engineers, but for soldiers. Simple to repair, impossible to break." They drained the oil, thick, golden, and still clean after hundreds of combat hours. They inspected the cylinders, each polished like a mirror, coated with a high-temperature alloy unfamiliar to the Germans. The metallurgy team suspected the Americans were using nickel-chromium blends far beyond German industrial capability in late 1943. Then came the real shock: the turbo-supercharger system. Mounted behind the cockpit, connected through long exhaust ducts, it forced compressed air back into the engine, a design the Germans had dismissed as inefficient. Yet when they tested it, the results shattered every assumption. The Thunderbolts R-2800 maintained full power even at 30,000 feet, while the German BMW 801 engine lost nearly 40% of its rated output at that altitude. The test report from November 25th stated bluntly, The American system is superior in high-altitude power retention. The combination of exhaust-driven turbocharging and intercooling gives performance unmatched by any engine in the Reich. Hans-Werner Lurk, the test pilot assigned to fly it, was initially skeptical. The Thunderbolt looked heavy, almost clumsy. But on November 27th, when he pushed the throttle forward on runway 4, he realized what he was sitting on. Acceleration was steady, unstoppable. The aircraft felt like it wanted to tear through the air rather than fly over it. It climbed faster than our WWII, despite weighing almost twice as much. At altitude, Lurk performed a dive test, a procedure known to terrify even seasoned pilots. As he pushed the stick forward and the Thunderbolt plunged earthward, the airframe screamed under compressibility forces. But unlike the Bf-109 or FW-190, it didn't lose control. It simply kept accelerating. When he landed, his first words to the engineers were, "If this plane had a swastika on it, I would think we had already won the war." Over the following days, German engineers disassembled every major component. They weighed, measured, and photographed each piece. The landing gear astonished them. Thick as a tank's, yet perfectly balanced. The propeller assembly, a Curtiss electric unit, adjusted pitch automatically using an electronic controller. Even the cockpit instrumentation seemed futuristic. The radio system, an SCR-274N, provided crystal-clear communication at ranges that made German FUG-16 sets look primitive. The Thunderbolt even carried an IFF, identification friend or foe, transponder, something most German pilots had never seen. "They have built not an airplane," wrote one Luftwaffe engineer, "but a flying fortress for one man." But what impressed them most wasn't any single system. It was the philosophy behind the design. The Thunderbolt wasn't crafted with scarcity in mind. It was designed for a nation that had more aluminum, more fuel, more factories, and more manpower than any enemy on Earth. Every component reflected abundance. Dr. Mertens summarized it perfectly. They can afford to waste steel to save hours. We must waste hours to save steel. In late November, the captured aircraft was officially reclassified as Butte Flugzeug T9 plus FK, captured aircraft T9 plus FK. Rechlin engineers prepared a detailed dossier for the Technisches Amt der Luftwaffe, technical office of the Air Force. Their conclusion was not comforting. The American design demonstrates an industrial philosophy incompatible with the realities of the German war economy. It cannot be copied with available resources. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's top minds confronted an uncomfortable truth that Germany's technical brilliance could no longer compensate for its industrial limitations. They weren't just studying an airplane. They were staring at the future and realizing it didn't belong to them. December 2nd, 1943. The icy wind cut through the pine forests of northern Germany as dawn broke over the secret test airfield at Recklinghausen. On the frozen tarmac stood an aircraft that no one could quite believe belonged to them. The captured P-47 Thunderbolt, tailcode T9 plus FK, its skin still carrying faint scars of American olive paint beneath the black German crosses hastily sprayed over it. Around it, a group of Luftwaffe officers stood in silence, breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air. One of them, Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lurk, zipped up his leather flight jacket and stared at the beast. He had flown every frontline aircraft Germany possessed, from the Bf-109G to the FW-190A, even prototypes of the Me-210 and Ta-152, but nothing looked quite like the Thunderbolt. "It looks like a flying barrel," joked a mechanic. Lurk smirked. "Then let's see what kind of thunder this barrel can make." At 7:42 a.m., Lurk throttled forward, and the massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp roared to life. The propeller, a Curtiss electric constant speed unit, blurred into a translucent disk. The ground vibrated beneath it. German observers watched from the control tower, some covering their ears as the engine's deep growl rolled across the airfield. Within 300 meters of takeoff, Lurk noted something shocking in his flight log. Power delivery, relentless. Rate of climb exceeds expectation. Engine response remained stable throughout acceleration. By 3,000 meters, the P-47 was still pulling strong. By 7,000, its power curve hadn't dipped. And when he reached 9,000 meters, 29,500 feet, an altitude where most German radial engines gasped for oxygen, the R-2800 was still roaring at near full boost. The turbo-supercharger at the back of the fuselage, once ridiculed as overcomplicated, was performing flawlessly. A mechanism driven by exhaust gases spun a turbine that compressed incoming air before sending it back through long ducts into the engine. To the Germans, it looked inefficient on paper. In the sky, it was magic. When Lurk descended and taxied back, his first words were simple. "It climbs like a rocket, and the engine feels immortal." The engineering team logged every second of that flight. Oil temperature, manifold pressure, boost readings, all stable. The American system, with its complex turbo and intercooler setup, had proven to be more reliable than any Luftwaffe design. On December 5th, the next test began, one that terrified even seasoned test pilots: high-speed dive testing. The Thunderbolt was known among Allied pilots as the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and for good reason. It was famous for surviving dives that would tear apart most aircraft. German engineers wanted to know if that was myth or reality. At 11:10 a.m., Lurk climbed to 28,000 feet, leveled off, and then pushed the nose forward. The P-47 plunged like a meteor. Wind screamed across the wings. The altimeter needle spun violently. The control stick grew stiff as the aircraft entered the transonic zone. On the ground, engineers watching telemetry data from barographs were stunned. The dive reached Mach 0.83, faster than any German fighter had ever achieved in controlled flight. When Lurk finally pulled up, his arms trembled, but the plane responded perfectly. "The dive characteristics," he later wrote, "are astonishing. It accelerates past 800 kilometers per hour and still holds together. In a 109, this would be suicide." And when he reached 9,000 meters, 29,500 feet, an altitude where most German radial engines gasped for oxygen, the R-2800 was still roaring at near full boost. The turbo-supercharger at the back of the fuselage, once ridiculed as overcomplicated, was performing flawlessly. A mechanism driven by exhaust gases spun a turbine that compressed incoming air before sending it back through long ducts into the engine. To the Germans, it looked inefficient on paper. In the sky, it was magic. When Lurk descended and taxied back, his first words were simple. "It climbs like a rocket, and the engine feels immortal." The engineering team logged every second of that flight. Oil temperature, manifold pressure, boost readings, all stable. The American system, with its complex turbo and intercooler setup, had proven to be more reliable than any Luftwaffe design. On December 5th, the next test began, one that terrified even seasoned test pilots: high-speed dive testing. The Thunderbolt was known among Allied pilots as the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and for good reason. It was famous for surviving dives that would tear apart most aircraft. German engineers wanted to know if that was myth or reality. At 11:10 a.m., Lurk climbed to 28,000 feet, leveled off, and then pushed the nose forward. The P-47 plunged like a meteor. Wind screamed across the wings. The altimeter needle spun violently. The control stick grew stiff as the aircraft entered the transonic zone. On the ground, engineers watching telemetry data from barographs were stunned. The dive reached Mach 0.83, faster than any German fighter had ever achieved in controlled flight. When Lurk finally pulled up, his arms trembled, but the plane responded perfectly. "The dive characteristics," he later wrote, "are astonishing. It accelerates past 800 kilometers per hour and still holds together. In a 109, this would be suicide." Even the mechanics who worked on the plane admitted something they'd never said aloud before. "We are losing the war in the factories, not the skies." By December 15th, the Thunderbolt was reassembled, refueled, and kept under armed guard in Hangar 12. It was now officially listed as Buurtflugzeug NR, 62 under the custody of the Luftwaffe Experimental Command. But whispers began to circulate that Berlin wanted the plane moved to Augsburg, where engineers at Messerschmitt could attempt to copy its systems for a new high-altitude interceptor. What they didn't realize was that by the time their reports reached the Reich Air Ministry, the tide of war had already turned. January 3, 1944. The train from Rechlin rolled into Augsburg, the industrial heart of southern Germany. On one of its flatbed cars, beneath a tarpaulin and guarded by 4 Luftwaffe sentries, rested an object of quiet obsession. The captured P-47 Thunderbolt, code T9 plus FK. The weather was merciless. Snow fell thick over the Messerschmitt Werke, where assembly lines once hummed with the sound of innovation. Now, with Allied bombers overhead almost daily, the complex was a shadow of its former self. When the tarpaulin was pulled back, a crowd of engineers gathered, among them, Willy Messerschmitt himself. The man who had designed the Bf 109, once the pride of the Luftwaffe, now stood face-to-face with a machine that seemed to have come from another world. "This is what we're fighting," he muttered, running a gloved hand over the Thunderbolt's armored fuselage. "This isn't an aircraft. It's a monster." The aircraft was brought into Hangar 3B, where engineers from Messerschmitt, BMW, and Junkers collaborated under a veil of secrecy. They called the project Operation Feuerhammer, Firehammer. The order for Berlin was clear. Determine the design principles of the American engine and supercharger. Assess feasibility for German production. Work began immediately. Teams dismantled the fuselage from tail to nose, photographing every cable, bearing, and bracket. The R-2800 engine was removed using a crane, its massive radial form dwarfing the German mechanics. When the cowling came off, the murmurs began again. The Thunderbolt's wiring harness looked nothing like German aircraft. Insulated, color-coded, routed with mathematical precision. One engineer whispered, "They build as if cost is no object." Dr. I.N.G. Friedrich Wegener, a propulsion expert from BMW, led the engine analysis. He stared for minutes at the General Electric turbo-supercharger, its impeller polished to mirror brightness. It was connected to a wastegate actuator that automatically adjusted exhaust flow, a mechanism far more sophisticated than anything in Germany's arsenal. "We cannot copy this," Wegener admitted. "We don't have the alloys, the high-temperature steels, or the factories to produce them in quantity." Even the intercooler ducts, which routed air through the fuselage before returning it to the engine, were shaped with aerodynamic precision. German factories, already stretched thin, couldn't replicate such designs without halting fighter production altogether. By January 18, 1944, a formal report titled Technische Bewertung des amerikanischen Jägers P-47D was sent to the Technisches Amt der Luftwaffe. Its conclusion was chilling. The American fighter demonstrates an approach to mass production that renders conventional engineering standards obsolete. While inferior in elegance, it surpasses all German designs in power, durability, and serviceability. A section of the report described the engine metallurgy in detail. Nickel-chromium-molybdenum alloys, heat-treated to sustain temperatures exceeding 350 degrees Celsius, were used in the turbo housing. Materials Germany could not mass-produce due to shortages of nickel and chromium. Another section noted, the aircraft electrical systems utilize sealed connectors and redundant circuits, allowing it to survive hits that would disable any Luftwaffe aircraft. Willy Messerschmitt's comment was blunt and bitter. They don't build fighters, they build factories that happen to fly. Despite the grim report, orders came from Berlin to replicate the design principles, particularly the turbo-supercharging system. Engineers began adapting elements of the Thunderbolt into ongoing projects like the TAL-152H and FW-190D9, both high-altitude interceptors. But the results were disappointing. Germany lacked the industrial infrastructure, the machine tools, the raw materials, even the philosophy to copy the Thunderbolt. Every attempt to recreate the turbo system ended in failure. Ducting warped under heat. Bearings cracked. Tolerances couldn't be maintained without specialized alloys. By February 1944, Dr. Wegener wrote in his notes, "The Americans have solved the altitude problem not by genius, but by industry. They have outbuilt us." Meanwhile, the Allied bombing campaign intensified. Thunderbolts, ironically the same type being studied in Augsburg, now escorted B-17s and B-24s that dropped ton after ton of explosives over German industrial centers. The sound that once echoed from the sky, the roar of the R-2800, now haunted the very engineers trying to understand it. One afternoon, during a break in the bombings, Messerschmitt's chief designer Robert Lusser stood outside the hangar, watching vapor trails carve across the winter sky. Next to him, a junior engineer asked quietly, "Herr Doctor, can we ever build something like the Thunderbolt?" Lusser sighed. "Not unless we become the America we are fighting." The remark spread through the team, quietly, bitterly, as a realization dawned. The war for the skies was no longer about technology. It was about production. Even as German engineers worked late into the night drafting blueprints and reports, they knew the truth. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of industrial dominance. A reminder that while Germany perfected machines, America perfected the means to build them. By March 1944, the disassembled Thunderbolt still sat in Hangar 3B, half covered with a canvas. Allied bombers struck Augsburg twice that month. When the smoke cleared after the second raid, the hangar's roof was gone, and the captured P-47 lay buried under twisted steel beams. The Germans never recovered it. All that remained were photographs, reports, and a single haunting sentence scribbled in a German engineer's notebook. "We have seen the future of air power, and it wears American stars." April 1944. At the Luftwaffe's high command in Berlin, a quiet meeting took place behind closed doors. The attendees were not pilots or generals, but engineers. Men whose hands smelled of oil and metal, not gunpowder. On the long oak table lay stacks of technical reports from Rechlin, Augsburg, and Oberpfaffenhofen, each stamped Geheime Kommandosake, top secret. At the head sat General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's inspector of fighters. His cigar burned low as he leafed through the pages of the report titled, "Evaluation of Captured American Fighter P-47D Thunderbolt." Galland was no ordinary bureaucrat. He had over 100 victories as a combat ace and knew the air war better than any man alive. But as he read through the engineer's findings, his expression darkened. "So this is what the Americans are building," he said finally, exhaling smoke. "And we've been fighting them with machines made for another world." The captured Thunderbolt had revealed uncomfortable truths, not only about engineering, but about philosophy. German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 had been designed for quick, decisive engagements. Light, agile, lethal at medium altitudes. But the Thunderbolt wasn't designed for duels. It was built for domination, long-range escort, high-altitude performance, heavy armament, and indestructible endurance. The Luftwaffe's combat reports from 1944 showed the consequences. German pilots who tried traditional dogfighting tactics were being outgunned and outclimbed. The Thunderbolts would dive from 25,000 feet, unleash their 8.50 caliber guns, and vanish before the German pilots could react. Galland's staff officer, Oberst Lutzbecker, summarized it bluntly. "The Americans have traded elegance for endurance. They don't need the better pilot. They need the last one still flying." That sentence became doctrine. Within weeks, Galland issued new tactical directives. German fighters were no longer to engage Thunderbolts in turning fights. Intercept tactics would emphasize high-speed diving attacks, followed by immediate disengagement. Every available resource would be redirected to developing high-altitude, high-speed aircraft. And thus, the Me-262 jet fighter, a project already in prototype testing, suddenly became the Reich's last hope. In May 1944, Messerschmitt engineers were summoned to Berlin to brief Hitler on the Me-262's progress. Among the team sat Dr. Robert Lusser, one of the men who had dissected the Thunderbolt months earlier. When Hitler asked what lessons had been learned from the captured American aircraft, Lusser, didn't hesitate. My Führer, the Americans have demonstrated that industrial might can replace genius. Their strength lies in production, not invention. Hitler fronet. Then we shall invent faster than they can produce. But that was wishful thinking. The Me-262, though revolutionary, suffered from fragile engines, limited materials, and political interference. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, represented the opposite. Not a miracle of innovation, but of consistency. Every nut, bolt, and bearing came off a production line that could build thousands more just like it. Even as Germany struggled to assemble a handful of jets, American factories rolled out over 15,000 Thunderbolts, each capable of carrying a bomb load heavier than a World War I bomber. The irony was not lost on Luftwaffe analysts. One engineer at Rechlin noted in his diary, "Our jet is a masterpiece that we can build only by hand. Theirs is a hammer that comes from 1,000 machines." By June 1944, as Allied troops stormed Normandy, the Luftwaffe's technical branch finalized a series of internal documents titled Lehren aus der Untersuchung der amerikanischen Jägers P-47D, Lessons from the Examination of the American Fighter P-47D. Its conclusions were grimly clear. 1. Turbo-supercharging superiority. The American system granted consistent engine performance up to 30,000 feet, beyond the limits of any German piston engine. 2. Material quality. American alloys, lubricants, and machining tolerances exceeded German standards due to abundant resources and industrial precision. 3. Pilot protection and reliability. Armor and redundancy systems prioritize survival and recovery, contrasting with the Luftwaffe's design philosophy of risk and agility. 4. Mass production mindset. American aircraft could be repaired or replaced faster than German pilots could down them. The final paragraph read, "In future conflicts, victory will belong not to the nation with the best pilot, but to the nation with the best production engineer." Galland underlined that sentence in red ink. By July 1944, Thunderbolts were flying in vast formations over France, strafing trains, convoys, and airfields. The Germans nicknamed them the Jugs, short for juggernauts, because they seemed unstoppable. One Luftwaffe pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Dortmann, recalled his first encounter. "We hit one, I saw parts flying off, and still it climbed away like nothing had happened. The pilot even rolled and fired back before diving into the clouds." That was the Thunderbolt's true power. It could take punishment and still fight back. At the same time, the Germans tried desperate measures. The Ta-152H, designed by Kurt Tank, was fitted with a high-altitude engine inspired by the Thunderbolt's performance. It could reach 45,000 feet, but only a handful were ever built before the war ended. In every Luftwaffe briefing, the same phrase appeared again and again. Überlegenheit der feindlichen Industrie, superiority of the enemy's industry. By September 1944, Rechlin's once bustling test fields were nearly silent. Bomb craters pockmarked the runways. Many of the engineers who had studied the Thunderbolt were now scattered across the country, some conscripted, others fleeing the constant Allied raids. Dr. Friedrich Wegener, the BMW engineer who had first examined the R-2800 engine, wrote one final report before evacuating to Bavaria. In its final paragraph, he reflected not as an enemy, but as an engineer. "We were taught to believe that perfection of design was the path to victory. But the Americans have shown that perfection lies in production, in the ability to make 10 good machines while we struggle to make one perfect one." His words echoed what many in Germany already knew. The war was lost not in the skies, but in the factories. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Allied technical teams scoured the ruins of Rechlin, Augsburg, and Oberpfaffenhofen. They found fragments of reports, half-burned photographs, and test notes on the P-47D. One British intelligence officer wrote in his summary, "The Germans learned more from the Thunderbolt than they did from any single engagement in the air." In the years that followed, the engineers who survived the war carried those lessons into the jet age. Some, like Kurt Tank and Wernher von Braun, went on to work in Argentina and America, designing aircraft and rockets that would shape the Cold War. And buried deep in their archives, copies of the P-47 evaluation reports remained as silent witnesses, proof that even the most advanced minds of Nazi Germany had once stood in awe of an American machine. Because when they took apart that captured Thunderbolt, they didn't just find metal and wires. They found a truth that terrified them. Power wasn't just built, it was mass-produced. May 1945. The airfields of northern Germany lay silent. Runways once filled with screaming engines were now covered in the wreckage of 1,000 lost dreams. At Rechlin, the great Luftwaffe test center, Allied troops moved cautiously among hangars still smelling of aviation fuel. Inside one of the steel buildings, an American officer stopped in front of a strange sight. An aircraft with half-faded German crosses painted awkwardly over American stars. It was P-47D Thunderbolt number 42 to 22,490, the same plane once flown by Lieutenant William Roach, now sitting like a ghost among the ruins. Its propeller bent, its canopy cracked, but the body still proud, massive, solid, alive. On the concrete floor nearby lay open German folders stamped Geheime Kommandosake, P-47 Versuchsbericht. Dozens of pages of flight data, technical diagrams, and handwritten notes. The last whispers of a defeated nation trying to understand a machine that had outlived its empire. Within days, the site filled with men from the U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Teams, specialists from Wright Field, Ohio. Among them was Major Charles Kelsey, one of the early advocates of high-performance fighter development before the war. Kelsey lifted a report written by German engineer Hans Werner Lerch, who had test-flown the captured Thunderbolt in 1944. The document was meticulous. Engine response graphs, dive speed calculations, and altitude performance tables. At the bottom of one page, Kelsey paused on a line written in careful German script. The P-47 embodies a new form of air power, one born not from a single engineer's brilliance, but from an entire nation's factories. Kelsey smiled faintly. They finally understood, he murmured. For every German engineer who tried to build perfection, America had built production perfection. And that realization, as the Allies soon discovered, would change warfare forever. By 1946, many of the same German engineers who once analyzed Thunderbolts were now working under Operation Paperclip, the U.S. program that brought German scientists to America. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, those men studied not just rockets and jets, but also the industrial systems that had made the P-47 possible. In seminars and technical debriefs, American officers quoted the very words the Germans had written about their captured Thunderbolt. They used it to teach new lessons, how to design machines that could win wars by the thousands, not by the prototype. One of those engineers, Dr. Robert Lusser, who had earlier helped design the V-1 flying bomb, later wrote that the Thunderbolt had forced him to rethink everything he believed about engineering. We Germans sought the perfect aircraft, Lusser admitted. But the Americans built an imperfect one perfectly, and that made all the difference. That single insight became known after the war as the Lusser Law, a principle that influenced aerospace engineering for decades. The reliability of a system decreases as its complexity increases. And that law was born from studying a single captured Thunderbolt. In the post-war years, the P-47's DNA lived on in ways few people realized. Its massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine became the basis for early jet transition programs, influencing airflow, metallurgy, and component cooling designs. The emphasis on maintainability, quick access panels, standardized components, simplified replacement, became the blueprint for every next-generation aircraft. Even the first true jet fighter of the U.S. Air Force, the F-84 Thunderjet, carried a name chosen as a tribute to its World War II ancestor, the Thunderbolt. And far from the laboratories and airfields, the lessons learned at Rechlin found new life in an unexpected place, the factories of Detroit. American automotive engineers applied the same mass reliability philosophy to post-war car production. The assembly line precision that had built 15,000 Thunderbolts now built millions of cars. The same metal that had armored cockpits now formed the skeleton of a new America, one that would never again be unprepared for war. But the Thunderbolt's legacy didn't end in the West. Captured Thunderbolt data also traveled east to Soviet engineers in Moscow, who received copies of Recklin's reports after the Red Army seized the facility. At WWII, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, Soviet analysts compared American supercharger designs with those used in the La-7 and Yak-9U. Their conclusion matched the Germans. The American system is inefficient in design, but perfect in application. That statement quietly shaped the Soviet approach to jet engines, prioritizing rugged, easily reparable systems over delicate, high-precision designs. Even a MiG-15, the jet that would later challenge American F-86 Sabres over Korea, carried traces of lessons born from that one captured Thunderbolt. History had come full circle. An American plane that taught Germany humility also helped define the engineering mindset of its next great rival. Meanwhile, the men who had been part of the story lived out quieter endings. Lieutenant William Roach, the pilot who accidentally delivered his Thunderbolt into German hands, returned home in 1945 after months in captivity. He resumed flying, but never forgot the irony that his mistake had helped the enemy understand American superiority. In a 1963 interview, Roach said softly, "I suppose my plane did more fighting in Germany than I ever did." Lieutenant Lloyd Hathcock, the Tuskegee airman who also lost his Thunderbolt, became an instructor after the war, helping integrate the newly desegregated U.S. Air Force. He later said in a speech, "If they learned from our planes, then maybe we did something greater than just win a war. Maybe we taught them what freedom can build." In 1977, Hans Werner Lerch published his memoir, Testing Allied Aircraft in War and Peace. In its final chapter, he described standing beside the P-47 he once flew for the Luftwaffe, years after the war, now as a visitor to an American air show. The aircraft was polished, its silver skin gleaming in the sunlight. I stood among the crowd and listened as the announcer spoke of its victories. And I thought of our reports, the hours we spent measuring, calculating, wondering how they built such power. Now I understood. It wasn't only power of machines. It was power of a nation that believed in what it was building. By the end of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 746,000 combat sorties and dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, more than any other Allied fighter. It had destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 6,000 tanks, and 68,000 trucks, reshaping the ground war across Europe. But its greatest achievement was invisible, the way it reshaped the very philosophy of war production. Germany's engineers, among the finest in history, had finally realized that the greatest weapon of the 20th century was not a jet, not a tank, not even a bomb. It was the assembly line. And standing at the center of that revelation was one machine, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a roaring, unstoppable monument to what happens when engineering genius meets industrial power. So next time you hear the distant thunder of an aircraft engine, remember this story, a story of how one fighter didn't just win battles, it changed the meaning of power itself. If you believe history is more than just dates, that it's the blueprint of human ambition, then don't stop here. Hit subscribe because in the next story, we'll open another secret file, one that reveals how the race for the skies became a race for the future.